Hello, and welcome to MTG Another Look. These are cards that you should take another look at. Don't forget to like and subscribe to help the channel. Thank you. Let's take a look at Shigeki Jukai Visionary from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. Shigeki is a 1/3 enchantment creature for 1 and a green. It has a tap ability that costs 1 and a green. Tap and return Shigeki to your hand in order to reveal the top 4 cards of your library. You may put a land card from among them onto the battlefield tapped. Put the rest in your graveyard. It also has a channel ability for green XX. Discard Shigeki. Return X target non-legendary cards from your graveyard to your hand. First off, Shigeki has the ability to ramp. I think that's great, especially attached to a creature. It is a little slow, considering you have to wait a turn for Shigeki to no longer have summoning sickness. Although it is still possible to be continuously ramping each turn by paying 4 mana. You play Shigeki early, wait a turn, then next turn pay 2 to use the tap ability and return Shigeki to your hand to get a tap land into play, and then replay it on the same turn for another 2 mana. It's a bit slow, but the ability to be ramping every turn with 1 card is useful to be doing in the background, if there isn't a lot of pressure on you specifically by attackers. Ramping whenever you have extra mana doesn't exactly come off as threatening to opponents, so it's easy to do when they're distracted by someone else. Shigeki's tap ability also helps you fill the graveyard. Every time you activate the ability, you're getting at least 3 cards in the graveyard, which is fantastic. People play Satyr Wayfinder all the time in graveyard decks, and having a slower but repeatable Satyr Wayfinder that puts the land into play instead of your hand is an excellent addition to those kinds of decks. Things that trigger when cards are put into the graveyard from everywhere love these types of effects. Sir Conrad the Grim is one that will like being played alongside Shigeki that can help trigger its ability every turn and deal damage to opponents. Something nice about Shigeki returning itself to your hand when you activate the ability, which is usually a downside, is that it gives you the opportunity to use the channel ability when you're done ramping. It is an admittedly expensive double X cost to use the channel ability, but all parts of Shigeki kind of work together to good effect. The tap ability helps to ramp you, so you can pay more mana into the channel ability later on. It returns itself to hand to be able to be discarded, and it fills your graveyard along the way to allow access to good targets to return your hand with the channel ability. Remember that channel abilities can be activated as an instant, just like the tap ability. So if something big happens on board, a board wipe, or someone plays a finisher that you have to immediately deal with, you can bounce Shigeki to dodge removal, and then use the channel ability to return a removal spell to your hand to deal with an opposing finisher. Or it can help you find your important combo or synergy pieces by dumping things into the graveyard and then returning it to hand. Shigeki cannot return legendary creatures from the graveyard, which gets more and more relevant as time goes on, with the number of legendary creatures being printed skyrocketing, but being able to, at end of turn, channel Shigeki for 6 or 8 mana to return 2 or 3 of your best cards from the graveyard can be a huge swing in your favor. In grindy games, the long-term value of Shigeki can help you win wars of attrition. Shigeki goes great in graveyard decks that love to self-mill, like CDC Brood Tyrant, to help trigger it for more zombies, or enchantment decks that care about casting enchantments and would like to cast Shigeki repeatedly for value, like Calyx, Guided by Fate, or decks that care about exploiting as many different card types as possible, like Atraxa Grand Unifier. Next, let's talk about White Plume Adventurer from Commander Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate. It costs 2 and a white for a 3/3 and says, when White Plume Adventurer enters the battlefield, you take the initiative. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, untap a creature you control. If you've completed a dungeon, untap all creatures you control instead. I know that playing with cards that introduce dungeons into the game can be a little bit of a drag, since it's something that each player needs to keep track of, on top of what can often be messy or confusing board states, but sometimes it's worth it. White Plume Adventurer gives you the initiative when it enters the battlefield. That means that when it comes into play, you get to move into the first room of the Undercity, and once you have the initiative, it will trigger again at the beginning of your upkeep, or if someone deals combat damage to you, they take the initiative and move into the first room of the Undercity. It's a little confusing when you first encounter it, but it works a lot like the Monarch, in that players can steal it from each other by attacking, and if you keep it for a turn cycle, it will trigger on each of your turns. When White Plume Adventurer ETBs, you get to enter the first room, which lets you search for your library for a basic land and put it in your hand. That's not too bad by itself. I've played partially white decks that are trying to be aggressive, but have a very difficult time adding pressure to the board without neutering your hand and getting clunky when it comes to consistent land drops. The Adventurer, with no other synergies, will give you 3/3 for 3 that helps smooth out your mana base. It can help fix you and ensure you have a land drop every turn of the game, something you should be aiming for. And since taking the initiative happens when White Plume Adventurer ETBs, that means it combos with blink effects. You can blink it to move further into the dungeon and choose different effects, even if you can't successfully attack the player who currently has the initiative. Or you can blink several times in a row to trigger several different dungeon effects immediately. The other dungeon effects can make opponents lose life, draw cards, or even add additional creatures to the battlefield from the top of your library. So in aggro decks and colors that struggle with card advantage, taking or keeping the initiative can help you keep pace with decks in other colors that draw more easily. White Plume Adventurer also untaps a creature on each of your opponent's turns, allowing more effective blocking, or helping you use tap abilities multiple times a turn cycle. And if you complete a dungeon, it will untap all your creatures on opponent's turns, acting similarly to a Seedborn Muse. Seedborn Muse is immensely powerful, and in the right decks, just untapping all your creatures can be nearly as backbreaking for opponents. Mana dorks like Fabro Elder can give you the mana to activate other abilities, and will provide 4 times as much mana as normal without the untaps. You can use those creatures to fuel convoke spells, or just use powerful tap abilities more times than you should be able to, like that of Arcanus the Omnipotent. It's hard to stress how powerful untapping can be. Seedborn Muse is a $10 plus card for a reason. White Plume Adventurer is a great card for exploiting powerful tap abilities in decks like Marique Rebarret, or playing more fair alongside convoke strategies like Saint Traft and Rem Carolus, but can also be fantastic in blink value piles like with Duke Ulder Ravenguard. Next, let's take a look at Torrent Elemental from Fate Reforged. It costs 4 and a blue for a 3/5 flying elemental that reads, whenever Torrent Elemental attacks, tap all creatures defending player controls. It has an ability that costs 3 and 2 black and green hybrid, so 5 mana total. Put Torrent Elemental from exile onto the battlefield tapped. Activate only as a sorcery. Torrent Elemental is a card that kinda confounds me. I think the card is generically powerful, but can't find strategies that it synergizes with specifically. But I think the first ability is what's really relevant about Torrent Elemental. Whenever you attack with it, you get to tap all creatures that one opponent controls and have all your creatures hit them unhindered. I think that's actually really powerful. Torrent Elemental has the ability to knock players out of the game in the right circumstances, and that's an ability that can't be overlooked, although I think it has been overlooked. I think a lot of people just aren't familiar with the card, along with the fact that Torrent Elemental's color identity kinda holds it back. Notice that although it is only a blue card, the black and green activation cost of its Return from Exile ability does make the card's color identity Sultai, or blue, black, and green. That really limits the number of decks it can fit in, and looking through Sultai or more colored commanders, there aren't really any that it fits the theme of well. I suppose it can be used for delve costs, like with Tassigur the Golden Fang, and then return to the battlefield from exile, and if it dies, maybe delved again, but that's pretty limited value. The main use would come from its first ability, a way to alpha strike an opponent without resistance. It of course fits in the Horde of Notions decks, as it's an elemental and will trigger the same elemental payoffs you want to play in that deck anyway, and it'll help your elementals hit opponents more easily. It can be fun to copy Torrent Elemental with the Mimeoplasm, as the ability exiles the elemental from the graveyard, and then it can return itself. And a massive Mimeoplasm with lots of counters can make good use of the ability to tap down blockers. But I think Torrent Elemental is worth some testing in decks that aren't focused all around the commander. I think the tap down effect is generically powerful and can help mid-range and aggressive decks finish out games and punch through board stalls. This is a very budget card. At time of writing, it's going for about $25. Give it a try and let me know what your experience was like. Next up is Vonas Hunger from Rivals of Ixalan. It's an instant for 2 and a black. Each opponent sacrifices a creature. If you have the city's blessing, instead each opponent sacrifices half the creatures they control rounded up. Now this is a good removal spell. Without the City's Blessing, it's a 3-mana Edict effect, but for each player. And removal spells that get rid of a creature from each player are way more valuable and usable in Commander, since it's a 3-for-1 that can kinda keep pace with 3 opponents. Playing this in the early game or after someone wraths can put opponents in a bind and take out their commander or the creature they plan to rebuild with. But if you have the City's Blessing, Vonas Hunger turns into a much bigger deal. It can act as a pseudo-wrath, taking out half of all opponents' creatures. Wiping out several tokens or half of the big creatures your opponents have is a lot of value, and if they have only one creature or are playing a Voltron deck, you still force them to sacrifice it. Your opponents will get to choose which creatures to sacrifice, which means they'll often keep their best creature, but you'll still do a lot of destruction to their board. Vonas Hunger can be fired off as an instant just to cool the herd a bit, or to set off your Blood Artist triggers whenever you want. Can you really expect much more for 3 mana? Vonas Hunger goes well in a control-y build like Toshiro Umezawa, or a deck that cares about sacrifice effects like Mazarek Crawl Death Priest, or a deck that wants to steal creatures that die like Giza Glorious Resurrector. Last is Brass's Tunnel Grinder from Lost Caverns of Ixalan. Brass's Tunnel Grinder is an artifact that costs 2 and a red. When Brass's Tunnel Grinder enters the battlefield, discard any number of cards, then draw that many cards +1. At the beginning of your end step, if you descended this turn, put a boar counter on Brass's Tunnel Grinder. Then, if there are 3 or more boar counters on it, remove those counters and transform it. On the backside is a land that taps for a red mana. Whenever you cast a permanent spell using mana produced by Tekutlan the Searing Rift, discover X, where X is that spell's mana value. Okay, first of all, this is a 3-mana self-wheel effect. It's kinda like a Valakut Awakening, but it puts the cards into the graveyard instead of on the bottom of your library. It trades the instant speed of Valakut Awakening for the upside of graveyard synergies. The wheel effect is surprisingly strong. Being able to choose what cards you want to discard to sculpt your perfect hand means you never have to make a hard decision to discard something you need because the rest of your hand is bad. Putting the cards in the graveyard is also a big deal because it can give you reanimation targets. It can fuel your Goblin Welder or set up a big flashback style turn with something like Mizzix's Mastery. The wheel effect on the Tunnel Grinder is also an ETB effect, so it can be blinked. It can be used alongside something like Nahiri's Resolve to get the effect repeatedly, and when you do blink it, you get to draw 1 extra card each time than what you discard. The land on the back of Brass's Tunnel Grinder is also great. It gets you free card advantage with Discovery each time you cast a permanent spell. You either get an extra card in your hand, or you get an extra card and cast it for free. That's an awesome ability to have around. But personally, I think Brass's Tunnel Grinder should be played with the expectation that transforming it, while it would be awesome, is also unlikely to happen. It does take 3 turns to make it happen, barring any kind of counter-proliferation, and that's a lot to ask. Sometimes it'll happen, but most games it'll just get swept up in a Wrath effect, or you won't be able to consistently descend quick enough. The transform land is just a little extra cherry on top of an already good card. Brass's Tunnel Grinder goes great in a double-sided Cards Matter deck like Tetsun, Gnome Champion, or as an additional wheel with possible upside in non-competitive Niv-Mizzet, Perun decks, or in decks that loop artifacts in and out of the graveyard, like Duretti Scrap Savant. I want to say thank you to everyone that joined me today to discuss some cool Commander deck options. What do you think of these cards? Are they worth a shot in one of your decks? Let me know in the comments and join me next time to take another look. Have a great day.